This is One Sentence News, a daily podcast featuring 3 news stories with a sentence-long summary and 1 sentence of context apiece. I'm Colin Wright. This is a sponsored message. I've been using Anchor as my podcast host for a while now, and it's been a pleasure to use. Anchor offers benefits that most other hosts do not. It's free to use, but it also has a collection of tools that allow you to create a podcast completely within the Anchor website or smartphone app. They distribute your show to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other distribution channels without any additional effort on your part, and you can make money from your podcast without any minimum audience size. So you can use it as a more traditional podcast host like I do, but it's also got everything you need to start a podcast from scratch. If you're keen to give it a shot, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. It's Tuesday, October 4th, 2022. Let's talk about the news. From the Wall Street Journal, Ukraine gains full control of Lyman, days after Putin claimed Russia rules there. Last week, Russian President Putin hosted a ceremony during which he gave a speech, celebrated referendum results from conquered Ukrainian territories, which were broadly considered to be illegitimate, and declared that those territories would be annexed, as supposedly requested. A few days later, Ukrainian troops reclaimed a key city in one of those regions. There's a lot to be skeptical about when it comes to announcements on both sides of this conflict, but those referendums were fairly transparently fake, and Ukrainian troops do seem to have run their Russian opposition out of Lyman. So this would seem to be a pretty embarrassing turn of events for Putin. That said, Ukraine's follow-up request to join NATO sooner rather than later is unlikely to be honored, despite the slew of other Eastern European governments who have signed off on the request. And Putin has upped his threats to use nukes at some point, so things are still pretty tumultuous and horrible thereabouts, despite the slow accumulation of victories for the Ukrainian side. From BBC News, Brazil's Lula and Bolsonaro face runoff after surprisingly tight result. Brazil's recent presidential election ended without any candidate receiving 50% of the vote, so the 2 leading candidates, current President Bolsonaro and former President Lula, will face off in a runoff election in about a month. The far-left Lula won this round of votes with 48% of votes cast, but far-right Bolsonaro claimed a surprisingly high 43% of the votes, a much stronger showing than polls have predicted of late. This election is being closely watched, as Bolsonaro has claimed without evidence that if he loses or even fails to get at least 60% of the vote, that means the country's election infrastructure has been rigged against him, and he might consequently use the military to host a self-coup and keep himself in office, while Lula's election would shift the country's government significantly leftward, matching the trajectory of the rest of the continent, but alarming some business leaders who worry about higher taxes and nationalization under his potential administration. And from Reuters, Burkina Faso soldiers announce overthrow of military government. Members of the military in Burkina Faso announced that they've overthrown the government last week, appearing on television wearing masks and military fatigues to confirm that the president is no longer in power, and to announce the suspension of the constitution, the closure of borders, and a nightly curfew. The now former president has since confirmed his forced resignation and has left the country for Togo. And to be clear, this now former president himself led a coup to overthrow the president of the country before him. So this is the nation's second coup this year, and it follows a pattern we've seen across West and Central Africa in recent years, with the governments of Mali, Chad, and Guinea all toppled by military coups since 2020. If you're finding some value in One Sentence News, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your podcasts and/or sharing the show with a friend. You can find out more about this show or subscribe to the email version at onesentencenews.com, and you can support this and other related projects like the Let's Know Things and Brain Lenses podcasts at understandery.com.